He mocked the watch like it meant nothing. But in this building, some objects carry the weight of legacy, and some silences hold more power than a VP's son will ever understand. He just didn't know who was about to walk in. The conference room lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the polished glass table. Outside, the city glimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, everything felt dimmed, as if the room knew what was coming before any of us did. I had taken my usual seat, not at the head, not even close. Back corner, near the auxiliary screen. Far enough to be forgotten. Close enough to watch everything. That's when he said it. "Only losers wear that," Ryan muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice soaked in self-satisfaction. He was talking about my watch. I didn't flinch. I didn't answer. I just looked down at the faded leather strap, the scratched silver face, and smiled. Because this watch wasn't about style. It was about memory, about who gave it to me and why I never once took it off in 12 years. But Ryan wouldn't know anything about that. He only noticed brands, not meaning. 2 seats down, Legal blinked sharply. She knew what he'd just done, and whom he'd just insulted without knowing it. But I said nothing, because sometimes silence is the most powerful thread in a room full of noise. Ryan leaned back, still smirking. He always thought his jokes landed. Always assumed his father, the vice president of strategy, would back him up, clean up the awkwardness, smooth the ripples. He didn't know yet that his ripples were about to become a tsunami. The VP entered moments later, ignoring his son's pointed nod. He was sharp today, pressed shirt, narrowed eyes, a man already on edge. He didn't sit, just stood at the head of the table and said, "Let's begin." But we didn't, because that's when the client walked in. You could hear it in the air shift. The door opened quietly, but the energy dropped hard. He didn't need to be introduced. The entire floor recognized him. Suit tailored, hair silver, presence heavy, one of the founding partners of the investment fund that kept our operations breathing. But he didn't look at the VP, didn't look at the CEO, he looked at me. No, not at me, at my wrist. And then he stopped walking, dead still, like he'd seen a ghost wearing a necktie. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but surgical. "Where did you get my father's watch?" The room froze, the kind of silence you don't prepare for. Ryan's smirk slid right off his face. The VP inhaled sharply. Legal turned her eyes toward me, not out of curiosity, but as if she already knew something important had just detonated. "And I?" I smiled again. Because some legacies don't scream. They wait, wrapped in leather, ticking beneath a cuff, until someone finally listens. If you think that moment was uncomfortable, wait until you hear the full name he said next. The silence didn't fade. It thickened. The kind of silence that doesn't just linger, it rearranges the air. All eyes were on me, but mine were on the man who had just stopped time. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed not on my face, but on the watch. His jaw was tight, and for a second I wondered if he'd speak again. But then his voice landed, softer, more human than I expected. That watch belonged to Salvador Ortega. And there it was, a name that meant nothing to most of the room. But to me, it was the name of the man who had mentored me when I was just a paralegal, who taught me how to write clauses that didn't bleed when slashed, who never raised his voice, only his standards. And yes, the man who, on his last day in the office, slid this watch across the table and said, "You won't need to tell anyone you're ready. They'll know when they see this." I stood slowly, not out of defiance, out of respect. He gave it to me, 12 years ago. I was just a nobody trying to figure out which way was up in a merger clause. He said it belonged to people who listened more than they talked. The client's throat tightened. You could see it. He nodded once, then looked around the room like he was suddenly remembering where he was. My father wore that during every major deal he ever closed. Even after his stroke, when he couldn't speak clearly, he wore it. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Then, like someone trying to pretend none of this was happening, he chuckled. "Look, I'm sure that's a sweet story and all, but that's just some old watch. It's not like it's—" "You called it a loser's watch," the client cut in. His voice, this time, had iron beneath it. Ryan froze. The VP looked up, his mouth slightly open, the faintest sign of fear crossing his usually bored expression. Legal didn't blink. She didn't need to. She knew this was no longer about optics. This was about legacy. The client turned to the room, his hands calm at his sides, but everything in his posture screamed control. This man wears something that matters more than your title, more than your quarterly report, more than your forced branding deck. He looked at Ryan again. You laughed at your own ignorance, but what you didn't realize is that my father only ever gave that watch to someone he trusted with silence, with dignity. Ryan looked like he might speak again, but the VP finally moved. Ryan, he said, just that. And Ryan sat down, slowly, quietly, for the first time in his life, probably. Then the client faced me once more. You kept it in good condition. I kept it working, I said. He smiled. A quiet, knowing thing. Then let's make it official. I want you on the legacy portfolio team. We'll talk terms after this meeting. The entire room shifted, just like that. Not a raise, not a nod. A transfer into the one group where every signature meant millions. Because sometimes a career doesn't turn on a promotion. It turns on who remembers the silence you protected. And if you think that moment rewrote the room, wait until you see what was buried in last quarter's signed contracts. After the meeting, no one rushed out. People always do, grabbing phones, muttering client call as an excuse to flee, but today they lingered, half out of curiosity, half out of fear. Ryan disappeared the second the door unlatched. The VP followed, slower, with a look that wasn't disappointment, it was calculation. I stayed behind, standing next to the chair I always sat in, the same spot I had occupied for years, unnoticed, until now. The client, now my client, gave me a nod before leaving. No handshake. Just that look again, the kind that says, I remember people like you. I opened my laptop, not because I had something to prove, because I already knew what I needed to look for. It started with a flag discrepancy in the legacy portfolio, a detail only someone trained by Salvador Ortega would even notice. Line 1948, subsection D, a phrase buried in dense legalese. Contingent disbursement eligibility may be waived by executive discretion during the periods of digital restructuring. Sounds harmless, sounds like nonsense actually, until you realize what it allows. One person, one signature, unlimited access to funds marked contingent, the most protected line in the legacy vault. And guess who had signed off on it? Initials, R.O. Ryan Ortega. I didn't panic. I documented. Screenshots, audit logs, version histories, Zoom folder timestamps, the whole Excel blood trail. Each step of the way, I could feel Salvador's voice in my head, calm and methodical. You don't shout when you see a fire. You seal the doors and make sure it burns in the right direction. I didn't go to HR. Not yet. I went to legal, but not through channels. I waited until she was heading to the elevator and handed her a USB. Legacy, line 148. Just read. She looked at me for a second too long, then tucked the USB into her case without a word. The next morning, the VP wasn't in the office. Ryan was, but not in his usual spot. He was sitting in the reception lounge, tie loosened, scrolling his phone like a man trying to stay visible, just in case someone came looking. No one did. At 9:41 a.m., Legal walked straight into the main meeting room with the CEO and the head of internal audit. 10 minutes later, a calendar update pinged across the floor. Urgent. Review of a legacy contract language. 10:30 a.m. No context, no invite list. Just 3 names, mine, Legal's, and the client. The fire had been sealed. The oxygen was disappearing, and the people who once laughed at my watch were now sweating over the clause no one else even saw. Because what's more dangerous than a contract? A contract written by someone who was taught never to be seen until it's too late. If you thought the clause was buried deep, wait until you see who helped him plant it there. The meeting room was cold, not in temperature, in tone, in intention, the kind of cold that settles into a place when trust has been cracked open and everyone's pretending they didn't smell the smoke. I arrived 3 minutes early. Legal was already there. No eye contact, just a subtle nod, the kind that says, we're past titles now. The client entered precisely at 10:30, no jacket, no assistant. Just a printed copy of the contract with a yellow tab on line 1I48. He placed it on the table like it was evidence in a trial. Let's begin. Legal opened a file. Inside was a second document, a version history with 3 timestamps. The first, clean language, tight clause, standard protection. The second, a subtle addition. Line 148 begins to bloat. The third, the final version, signed. All eyes went to the signature block. It read, approved, Vice President of Strategy, and below that, a shaky, barely legible signature. It wasn't Ryan's, it was his father's. The silence was instant. The client leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, eyes unreadable. Legal spoke first. Based on the access log, Ryan modified the clause, but the system shows it was approved under his father's login credentials. I zoomed in on the metadata, timestamped, IP matched. The problem wasn't the clause. The problem was how it got through. This wasn't just negligence, I said. It was access abuse, credential spoofing, potential executive fraud. No one corrected me, because no one could. The client exhaled, long, controlled. So the VP signed off on a clause he never saw, or someone used his credentials to make it look that way. Legal nodded, which means either gross incompetence or a deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. The air in the room snapped tight. The kind of tension that always comes before the most dangerous question, who else knew? I pulled out a printed call log, something no one expected me to have. Zoom call, 8 weeks ago, folder named quarter end wrap. Inside, one call, 33 minutes. Attendees, Ryan, the VP, and one surprise name, not legal, not audit, brand strategy. The woman who ran all internal messaging, the same one who last month launched a campaign about trusting leadership, the same one who accidentally forwarded the draft language to the communications team before the contracts were finalized. That's when legal's expression changed, not shocked, confirmed. She knew this went deeper, and now, so did the client. He stood slowly, gathering the documents like puzzle pieces falling into place. I'll be requesting a full audit of all communication logs between strategy and internal messaging. Then, looking at me, you saw what no one else wanted to. You'll be in the room from now on. No title, no desk move, no applause, just access. Real access. Because in this office, the most powerful seat isn't always the one at the head of the table. Sometimes it's the one closest to the truth, and just quiet enough to hear it. If you think that's where the chain of custody ends, wait until you find out who's been protecting Ryan from day one. People in the office began talking, not openly, of course, but in half glances and whispered exchanges outside the glass walls, the ones meant to look casual but carried razor wire tension underneath. The VP hadn't returned since the audit notice. Ryan was suddenly working remotely. Brand strategy was on a short sabbatical, and yet the pulse of it all hadn't died. If anything, it was getting louder, but underground. I received an email late Thursday night. No subject line, no signature, just a file attached. Chain Discovery DocX. I scanned it cautiously. Inside was a clean report of a document access trail, not to the manipulated clause, but to something earlier. The original SharePoint log from Salvador Ortega's final week. I froze, because I knew what this was. It wasn't about the clause anymore. It was about who had access to the permission system back then, and how those privileges had never been revoked. The audit trail led straight to an internal form. Policy 9.3 Executive Delegation. Overrides. A policy buried 5 levels deep in compliance documentation. It allowed one person, once every fiscal year, to issue a temporary override of system permissions, including on contract platforms. It required 2 approvals, one from executive strategy and one from internal affairs. I expected the strategy sign-off. That was the VP. But the other? It wasn't HR. It wasn't legal. It was the head of internal affairs, who had quietly resigned 3 years ago. No announcement, no memo, just vanished. I ran to the old archive system, searched his name. Nothing. No exit statement. No severance record. Only one document remained, marked confidential, decommissioned. It was a scanned letter, written in pen. It simply said, "To whom it may concern, If this policy ever resurfaces, know that the signature was forged. I never approved the override, and I never trusted the vice president. Initialed, stamped, dated 2 days before the VP's promotion. I forwarded the file to legal. 10 seconds later, I got one response. Noted. Keep this off internal servers. Speak to no one else. She knew. We both did. The fraud wasn't just Ryan's bad idea. It was a system of permissions, a gate built by someone who assumed no one would ever check the foundations. But now we had something stronger than evidence, intent. The next morning, a legal envelope arrived on my desk. Inside, a subpoena copy for archived executive access logs, issued directly by the client's legal team, requesting full access to documents tagged under Policy 9.3 and silent overrides. No one could stop this now, because this wasn't just about contracts. It was about a culture built to protect its own, until the wrong person asked the right question. And if you think the walls were starting to crumble, wait until you hear who sent the anonymous file. The office had changed. Not visually, the same brushed metal elevators, same abstract art that no one liked but everyone pretended to admire, but in sound. People had stopped laughing. Meetings were quieter, doors closed faster, and eyes didn't linger in hallways anymore, because now silence meant survival. I still didn't know who sent the anonymous file. The metadata had been wiped clean, no author tag, no device ID, not even a location trace. But there was one clue, a small one. In the file's header, a single comment. Not everyone forgets who built this place. It wasn't Salvador's voice, it wasn't his style, but it was someone who remembered him, or at least what he stood for. So I did the only thing that made sense. I looked for the people who had disappeared. 3 names came up. The head of internal affairs, vanished, but now vindicated by that letter. An old compliance auditor, transferred to the European branch mid-cycle with no successor. And finally, the receptionist from Salvador's last year, not fired, not promoted, quietly removed from the directory. That was the thread. And when I pulled it, everything began to unravel. Her name was Lucia. I remembered her vaguely. Warm voice, always had tea in the afternoons, knew everyone's schedule before Outlook did. She hadn't just been a receptionist. She had access to calendars, to logs, to patterns no one else noticed, like who stayed after hours, who printed contracts twice, who sent files without CCs. I searched the archives. She'd been the last person to schedule a one-on-one meeting between Salvador Ortega and the VP, 2 days before Salvador resigned. I left the office early and took a chance. Lucia was working part-time at a small tax office 2 blocks from downtown, her name still on the glass door. I walked in, nervous. She looked up from her desk, blinked once, and smiled. "You work in that building, don't you?" I nodded. She didn't ask how I found her. She didn't seem surprised. She simply opened a drawer and slid something across the desk. A flash drive. No label. I never knew what he meant by "watch who signs in silence," but I kept this, just in case. That night, I plugged it in. Inside were dozens of voice memos, low quality, fragmented, but unmistakable. Salvador, reading notes, dictating thoughts, venting, quietly, and one entry that stopped me cold. If this message ever gets heard, I didn't leave willingly. There's something inside Policy 9.3, not just about control, but about inheritance. Ryan's not smart enough to design it, but he didn't need to, because someone promised him he'd never have to face what I saw. I sat there, frozen, because the question I hadn't asked was finally clear. Who gave Ryan the power, and what were they trying to bury along with Salvador's exit? If you thought that flash drive was the key, wait until you see who made the final promise, and what it cost. I couldn't sleep. The flash drive sat on the desk like it could explode at any moment. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was true. Every word Salvador had whispered into those recordings wasn't just documentation. It was a map. A map of betrayal, loyalty, and power transfer, all hidden behind glass walls and polished resumes. And the destination? Ryan's promotion. He hadn't earned it. Everyone knew that. But the lie was never about performance. The lie was about timing. I dove back into the files, focusing on that window, the week before Salvador's resignation and the week after Ryan's fast-tracked elevation. I found an internal PDF marked Draft, Confidential Strategy Shift. Inside was language no one had shown in public decks, a clause that read, "In the event of executive succession disruption, discretionary promotion authority shall pass to the longest tenured strategy officer, pending override via policy 9.3. And who was the longest tenured strategy officer at the time? The VP himself. It was all there. Salvador had planned to expose internal manipulation, not just bad language in contracts, but an ecosystem built to crown Ryan, regardless of merit. But before he could move, the VP pulled policy 9.3, forged the approval, and pushed Salvador out under the guise of a health-triggered retirement. It explained everything. Why no farewell party? Why Salvador never packed his own things? Why his name was quietly removed from internal archives, like he'd never existed? And the promise? It came from higher. The emails between brand strategy and executive affairs weren't casual. They were coordinated. One message, 3 days before Salvador's removal, simply read, "Promotion secured. Legacy rebranded. The watch means nothing once the room forgets." They knew. They knew exactly what they were doing, erasing a man's work, erasing his memory, and betting no one would ever question the empty chair he left behind. I printed the email chain, took screenshots, made backups of the flash drive in 3 encrypted folders. Then I walked straight to the client's office. No appointment, no hesitation. He looked up. I placed the documents down and said just one sentence. It was never about Ryan. It was about what Salvador stood in the way of. The client didn't ask questions. He picked up the papers, stood, and said, "Call a full board review. I want every name tied to this thread." And as I turned to leave, he stopped me. "One more thing," he said, nodding at the watch on my wrist. "He gave you more than time. He gave you a reason to be the one who remembered. Because legacy doesn't just vanish when someone walks out the door. Sometimes it leaves behind proof, and someone just brave, or quiet, enough to uncover it. If you think the board was ready to face the truth, wait until you hear who tried to bury the entire audit." The morning of the board review, the air in the building felt different, not tense, watchful, as if the walls had been told to keep quiet, as if the coffee tasted just a bit too bitter. I arrived early, not out of fear, out of certainty. Everything I had, the flash drive, the email chains, the voice memos, was ready. I had labeled each file, numbered each page, organized every timestamp like a trial brief, because I wasn't just carrying evidence. I was carrying what they tried to bury. The boardroom was full. Legal, compliance, 3 independent directors flown in overnight, and 1 empty chair, marked VP of Strategy. It would remain empty. The client stood and opened the meeting with just 4 words. "We've been misled. Deliberately." He handed out printed packets. Page 1, Policy 9.3, Page 2, the forged approval chain. Page 3, the resignation letter from Internal Affairs, the one no one was meant to find. By page 5, the room had gone cold. And just when we thought the truth had finally landed safely, the head of compliance cleared her throat. "We can't proceed with the audit," she said. Her tone was flat, final. The room blinked. "Why not?" asked one of the board members. She tapped a folder. "Because 3 days ago, an internal memo was circulated from executive operations requesting the permanent deletion of all legacy personnel files predating 2020. Silence. It was signed, time-stamped, and approved using the client's digital signature. All eyes turned to him. He didn't move, because he already knew. "I never signed anything," he said quietly. Legal leaned in. "It appears your credentials were accessed off-site, proxy login, but the deletion was queued, not executed." The client turned to me. "Who would even have access to my signature file?" That's when I opened my laptop, pulled up the SharePoint access log. The name at the top wasn't Ryan, wasn't the VP, it was the Chief Technology Officer. He had stayed quiet through everything. Hadn't attended any of the internal meetings, hadn't replied to the audit pings, because he wasn't a strategist. He was the gatekeeper, the one who could make proof disappear with one keystroke. And now, he was trying to erase the entire chain, but he failed. Because Lucia's flash drive didn't just have recordings, it had a folder marked Backdoor Protocols. Inside, access logs, remote signature trails, the exact moment the CTO accessed the client's credential key. The client stood. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, he simply said, "Effective immediately, he's suspended. Internal Affairs will conduct a full forensic trace." Then, turning to the board, "And from this moment forward, no executive signs anything without dual authentication." That's when I understood the full shape of it. It wasn't just about Ryan. It wasn't even about Salvador. It was about a system built to protect power, no matter who got erased in the process. But now, that system had a fracture, and the fracture had a name: mine. If you think the CTO was the last line of defense, wait until you hear who tried to rewrite the minutes of this very meeting. 2 days after the board review, a new version of the meeting minutes was uploaded to the internal portal, sanitized, stripped, polished like a glass floor no one was supposed to walk on. I caught it by accident. The original draft had included every detail: Policy 9.3 violations, forged digital signatures, the CTO's credential breach, Lucia's flash drive archive. But the new version? All of it was gone, replaced with vague phrases like administrative discrepancies and internal procedural updates. Worse still, my name had been omitted entirely, as if I'd never been in the room. I checked the document's metadata. It had been edited at 2:14 a.m. by someone in executive communications, the same team that had crafted the trust in leadership messaging Ryan had used to cover his tracks, the same team that had coordinated with brand strategy during the clause manipulation. I called legal. No answer. Then an email. "We saw it too. Stay calm. Let us handle this one." But I couldn't. Because this wasn't a clerical error. This was an attempt to rewrite institutional memory, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I went back into the archives, found every version of the board minutes since the company's founding, tracked document IDs, authors, edit patterns, and there it was, a pattern no one had noticed. Every time an internal investigation reached executive leadership, a revised version of the meeting was quietly issued within 48 hours. Same author tag, same timestamp anomalies, same disappearance of names. It had been happening for over a decade. I pulled it all into a report, labeled each edit, highlighted each contradiction, tied them to outcomes, investigations that vanished, promotions that seemed unearned, whistleblowers who quietly moved on. Then I sent it. To exactly one person, the external legal counsel of the investment fund, not the internal team, not HR, because at this point, the rot was inside the walls. I added one line at the top: "If memory can be edited, what's left to trust?" 20 minutes later, I got a call. Not from legal, not from the client, from the chair of the fund's board. Her voice was razor sharp. "We've suspected there was a shadow protocol for years. You just proved it. We're initiating an independent inquiry, full scope. You're protected." Then, calmly, "We'll need your testimony, on record." That night, I sat alone with the watch, winding it by hand like Salvador used to, feeling the pulse of it, not in time, but in weight, because sometimes the only thing more powerful than evidence is the refusal to let someone else write your story for you. If you think the rewritten minutes were the final play, wait until you hear who walked in during the testimony and what they confessed. The testimony was scheduled in a quiet annex of the downtown legal center. No company logos, no press. Just a single long table, a recording mic, and 3 observers from the fund's oversight committee. I brought everything: printed timelines, encrypted drives, the flash drive from Lucia, and the watch, worn, silent, steady. I was ready to speak. What I wasn't ready for was who walked in next. She was late. 5 minutes past the scheduled start. But when the door opened and the head of brand strategy stepped into the room, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. She didn't look polished this time. No tailored blazer, no defensive posture, just tired eyes and a manila folder clutched tightly in her hands. She looked at the committee, then at me, then sat down. "Before you begin," she said, her voice flat, "I need to add something to the record." No one stopped her. The fund's lead counsel nodded once, and the recorder began to roll. She placed the folder on the table and slid it forward. This is every internal memo I received from the VP between Q2 and Q4 of last year. Instructions, talking points, phrases to embed into leadership messaging. He called it narrative reinforcement. She paused. I knew what I was doing, not all of it, not the forged signatures, but I knew enough. Her voice cracked, once, then returned. I was promised a VP seat if I helped reposition Ryan as a legacy asset. They said the family optics mattered to the fund. They said your watch was a branding problem. No one spoke. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. She continued. We planted language in the company reports, created a paper trail that made Ryan look competent, buried Salvador's departure behind fake wellness narratives. And then the sentence that made everyone stiffen. We also created alternate board minutes in 3 past investigations, not just this one. She slid another document across the table. Here's the master key we used to alter the audit logs. Only 3 of us had it. Me, the CTO, and the VP. She sat back. Didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't offer excuses, just stared at the watch on my wrist. I didn't know Salvador gave it to you. I thought it was a prop. I looked at her. Not with anger, not even pity, just the quiet realization that even those who help write lies sometimes wish someone would stop them. The fund's counsel closed her laptop. The board chair stood. This confirms systemic falsification of internal records. We will proceed with legal action and begin leadership restructuring immediately. Then, looking directly at me, you're not just a witness anymore. You're part of the rebuild. I left the room with nothing but the folder and the watch, but I didn't feel heavy, because for the first time since this began, the truth was heavier than the silence. And someone else was finally carrying it too. If you think that was the end, there's still one more name in the chain you haven't heard yet.